Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming across. My name's Guy Coxhall, and I run an organisation called Seed Our Future Campaign. This is Phil Monk.
Is that on? Oh, yeah, it is. Phil Monk from We the Undersigned. We're a grassroots community group that have curated a body of evidence that was hopefully going to be a human rights challenge against the government, but we haven't got enough money to play in court, unfortunately. So that's who I am, and we'll talk more about that afterwards.
Cool. So what we're here to talk about today is cannabis and the law. So we're looking at the actual legalities of the legislation and the research that both myself and Phil, well, both our organisations and the people, members of our organisations have put together. We've found that there's no evidence to the law, so therefore, is there a crime? So, introduction. So, the possession of cannabis, many of you might not know, has been illegal in the UK for 93 years now. For the last 50 years, within the Misuse of Drugs Act, 1971, it's considered a Schedule 1 substance with a Class B penalty. We're going to go into this in more detail. So the Home Office, who do the legislation, their justification for cannabis being illegal is that they claim that they have clear medical and scientific evidence of harms both to individuals and to society at large. This is something we can completely disprove. The ACMD, which is the Advisory Council for the Misuse of Drugs, they're the people who actually do the legislation, and they put a specific substance in a Class A, Class B, Class C. They actually stated that the high use of cannabis, I like the word high in there, is not associated with major health problems for the individual or society. But that's the criteria required by the Misuse of Drugs Act. However, they did continue that it's not a harmless substance. So that takes it to equity. Now, alcohol, tobacco, those two combined, they kill... 90% of all deaths related to drugs are related to those two legal substances, and they're not classified as illicit drugs. Even caffeine, sugar, pharmaceutical drugs. Pharmaceutical drugs have a prerequisite to have some sort of toxic value and have lots of side effects so that they can make money. So why is cannabis illegal? So this is what we're going to look at today.
Well, you mentioned, Guy, how it's based on the harms to the individual and society that they justify this legislation. Emphasis on the word justify. They have here the summary of their alleged harms. It's been referred to as the devil's weed. All the research that was done, which we'll go through in a moment, was extensively to try and prove how harmful and bad for your health cannabis actually is. And they came out with it causes insanity, psychosis and schizophrenia, which is skunk psychosis, the one that we all hear about. Addiction, brain damage, lung damage. The gateway drug is the old one, of course. And then, of course, we've got the propensity for violence and crime, which is a great one, and impaired driving. My advanced driving licence would beg to differ with that one. But interestingly, the insanity and schizophrenia psychosis, Harvard University showed it's 1 in 4,000 people may develop a schizophrenic episode from cannabis. So it's 1 in 4,000. So if you flip that, you've got to destroy the lives of 3,999 people with prosecution in order to protect one person from a transient cannabis-induced schizophrenic episode. So is it justified and is it proportionate would be the question that would raise. With addiction, people use cannabis to escape, myself, for example, opiate drugs from prescription drugs. Brain damage, cannabis is actually neurogenesis, so it actually stimulates brain growth. So it cannot cause brain damage because it causes brain growth. The lung damage, if it's with tobacco, yes, it does damage lungs, but there is research that shows pure cannabis, smoked and vaped, does not cause lung damage or lung cancer. The gateway drug has been thoroughly disproved. In fact, alcohol has been proven to be the gateway drug. And the crime and violence, we've even got the ACMD. This is the book from the WTU, by the way. The ACMD says here, the high use of cannabis is not... Oh, wait there. Oh, I hate it when you can't find the right one. Basically, it doesn't cause violence. It doesn't have a propensity to causing crime and violence. It's in there on page 31 if you'd like to have a look. And for the impaired driving as well, there's Monash University in Australia, and you've even got, I think GW did cannabis and driving as well. And I've got my own advanced driving licence, which I did after 2 bongs and 2 joints of high THC cannabis, because I had to know I was still safe to drive whilst medicating. So we can challenge all of those assertions, which we go further into. I'll pass you back to Guy now.
Thanks, Phil. So to start with, I'll just give you a very brief history of cannabis use globally. So it's been found that cannabis has been used at least for 10,000 years. There was some hemp rope found in pottery in what's now Taiwan from over 10,000 years ago. And in 1977, Carl Sagan proposed that cannabis was the first agricultural crop, and that led to civilization. So that's how important this crop has been. It's been used in Chinese medicine for over 120 different conditions for over 5,000 years. It's been used in the Vedic texts for over 3,000 years in India. Between 800 and 1800 AD, it was widely grown across Britain. It was a normal crop to have. And they even grew it in medieval religious hospitals. They grew it for the fibre to make clothing and textiles, paper. And they also used it in the hospitals as a medicine. So, we've got a rich history of it being used in the UK. In 1533, King Henry VIII decreed that it was law for farmers to set aside a certain proportion of land to grow cannabis, or hemp as it was referred to back then. And that was primarily for the Royal Navy. It was used for the ropes, the sails, the sailors' clothes, and every ship would carry a cargo of hemp seed. So when we colonized the world, the first crop we would lay down would be hemp or cannabis, same thing. In 1812, it's believed that during the Napoleonic War, that part of the reason for it was actually to control the supplies of Russian hemp. In 1844, William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, who was a doctor from Ireland, but he was working in Calcutta in India, he published some medical journals, and he found it was very successful for cholera, rabies, rheumatism, tetanus, and childhood epilepsy. Now that's interesting that in 1841, he had already found and researched that it was very effective for childhood epilepsy. And still today, kids aren't getting it accessed on the NHS, which is a disgrace. In 1856, the British government decided to tax the Indian cannabis trade, and they were making lots of money from that. And in 1890, Sir Reynolds, he was the doctor for Queen Victoria. He was prescribing Queen Victoria with a cannabis preparation for menstrual cramps. So that just gives you a bit of a history of worldwide and in the UK how cannabis has been used. But really, to understand the law and understand what the Home Office are stating, we need to go back into history to look at the history of prohibition. So to start with, the most comprehensive study ever carried out on cannabis worldwide was in 1894, so it was nearly 130 years ago now, and the British government commissioned a royal commission to look at the harms of cannabis in India, and it was called the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission. Now, it was a huge document, 7 volumes, over 3,000 pages. They had over 1,200 witnesses, 86 hearings in 36 cities. Nothing's been done like that before. So what the concerns were, and I think there were 2 main reasons for these concerns with the British government. One was that the Queen was using it, and the other reason was that they were highly embarrassed about all of the problems they'd done with opium, which I'm going to come to. So they were concerned that it causes insanity, that crime, violent behaviour, a weakened intellect or brain damage, and even homicidal frenzy. It makes people go out and just kill for no reason, which, it's almost balancing what we're actually seeing now with what the Home Office is saying. So what did they find after this 12-month study? So they found that hemp drugs do not produce any noxious effects, physical, mental, or moral. The moderate use practically produces no ill effects. The effects on society is rarely appreciable. Any prohibition will only lead to the increase of illicit consumption and to the secret use of the drug, which has obviously happened. So I mentioned opium before. So the British government and the US government had 70 years of opium trade where they were sending opium into China. And that actually caused 25 million opium addicts in China. It caused massive devastation. Lord Chief Justice at the time, he said, "We English, by the policy we have pursued, are morally responsible for every acre of land in China which is withdrawn from the cultivation of grain and devoted to that of the poppy, so that the fact of the growth of the drug in China ought only to increase our sense of responsibility." In 1909, 13 nations attended the International Opium Conference, and that was in Shanghai. They wanted to solve this problem mainly through embarrassment. So they discussed the prohibition of the cultivation and use of opium, primarily. In 1912, the International Opium Convention took place at The Hague, and that was incorporated in 1990. It was lagged due to the Great War, and it was put into the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. So, in Britain, they introduced the Dangerous Drugs Act because of this in 1920, and what they looked at was restricting the use of opium, morphine, cocaine, and heroin. But also, for the very first time, they considered addiction, which was primarily considered a disease, as a criminal act. And so, in 1924 to 25, the League of Nations conference in Geneva, they started looking at cannabis as well. And the reason for that was South Africa, it was mainly racial, as we have always seen in history. They considered cannabis as dangerous and addictive as opium. And there was an Egyptian delegate there called Mohammed El Gindi, and he was talking about hashish at the time, and he really wanted it to be banned globally. And he considered hashish a poison with no known antidote, the use of which leads to the breakdown of all bodily functions, eventually leading to insanity, and that hashish is responsible for 60% of cases of insanity. And this is still playing today with the psychosis, schizophrenia. It was actually shown that there wasn't any evidence of this. So in 1925 in the UK, the Dangerous Drugs Act was adapted and it included cannabis. And in 1928, for the very first time, the UK prohibited the use and possession of cannabis in the UK. So it's been 93 years, almost a century in the UK. So, prohibition to support corporate monopolies. You know, there's an agenda. There's always an agenda to these things. And it's the corporates who really wanted cannabis banned. So this is a little statement from Henry Ford, who obviously created the Ford car. With the US alcohol prohibition repeal in 1933, most stills were abandoned or seized by the dry squads. Oil was super cheap and everywhere, so oil engines grew more popular and alcohol or ethanol engines less so. And with US hemp removed from the economy, prohibition in 1937, the best raw material for making bioplastic feedstock was removed from the economy. So it was Rockefeller's Standard Oil, Mellon's Gulf Oil, and DuPont who had the most to do with hemp prohibition and the most to gain from it. So prohibition of cannabis led to the monopolization of the fossil fuels, plastics, pharmaceutical, the timber industry, and the cotton industries. And this has caused insurmountable harms, not only to our health, by getting rid of plant medicine and replacing it with toxic pharmaceutical medicine, it's also really caused all the devastation to the environment. All the stuff we're seeing now, the collapse of our ecosystem, is due to primarily the banning of cannabis, because it gave the fossil oil companies the monopoly, and all the other companies. So Harry Anslinger, every time I say his name, like the hairs on the back of my neck just go up, yeah. Prior to 1931, he was the Assistant US Commissioner for Prohibition, alcohol prohibition. And as Henry Ford stated there, the reason for alcohol prohibition was for the oil companies so that they could change the engine. In June 1930, he was handpicked to be the new Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and this was by his uncle-in-law, Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of State for the Treasury in the US under President Herbert Hoover. He was the designer of the FBN and the head of Gulf Oil. Andrew Mellon was also the owner and largest stockholder of the 6th largest bank in the United States at the time. and one of only two bankers for DuPont. So all of these people who within the oil companies and the pharmaceutical industry were all planning together to how do we get rid of this amazing crop so that we can make loads of money and destroy the environment. Aslinger was very much a racist, and he teamed up with William Randolph Hearst, who, if you think Citizen Kane, he was in charge of all the media and everything, and together they were making all these head news lines in the newspapers, vilifying cannabis, coming out with lies, and this is where the propaganda really started. And it was called the Gore Files. It was very much based around ideology and racism, which is still happening today. So just a few quotes here to give you an idea of the racist manner. There are 100,000 marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relationships with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. Marijuana is an addictive drug which produces in its users insanity, criminality, and death. Smoke a joint with, and you're likely to kill your brother. Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. Surely that's alcohol. Marijuana influenced Negroes to look at white women in the eye, step on white men's shadows, and look at a white woman twice. So gives you an idea, but it worked in America at the time because it was very racist over there, and it was getting that public opinion to think of this plant that most people grew anyway. They didn't know it was cannabis because they changed the name to marijuana, and they thought, oh, this dangerous drug, we must get rid of it. In 1937, this led to the Marijuana Tax Act. So it was a tax, not particularly a law. So what they did was there was a cannabis permit at £100 an ounce of cannabis, and this was a transfer fee. So those who applied for a permit had to provide their name, their address, their occupation, and this was passed to law enforcement officers. So this basically put anybody in a position, not only could nobody afford £100 an ounce, they also were incriminating themselves, and that was going to law enforcement, so they're going to get the door kicked in. Aslinger knew at the time that people wouldn't be able to afford it, and this also affected the cultivation of hemp, because an ounce of hemp was also a £100 tax. $100, sorry. So in 1938, after this act was passed without any discussion, it just went through very easily. The US company DuPont patented the process for creating plastics from coal and oil, and also a new process for creating paper from wood pulp, because prior to that, about 90% of paper was coming from hemp. So you could see they were already set, ready to position themselves. Dr. William C. Woodward, he was actually involved in the conference for the Marijuana Tax Act, and he was from the American Medical Association. He says, I know of no evidence that marijuana is a dangerous drug, and warned that a prohibition loses sight of the fact that future investigations may show that there are substantial medical uses for cannabis. Of course, they already knew that, and we still know that, but just think, since then, we've had worldwide prohibition pretty much. How many people have died and suffered unnecessarily over that time? That's mass genocide. So in 1944, there was something called the LaGuardia Report, and LaGuardia was the mayor of New York at the time. He didn't like what Aslinger was doing, and he didn't like the act. So he decided to consult with the American Medical Association and commissioned a study. It concluded that marijuana use was relatively safe, did not result in insanity, users were not prone to acts of violence, and that it was not addictive. So the practice of smoking marijuana did not lead to addiction in the medical sense of the word, did not lead to morphine or heroin or cocaine addiction, and no effort was made to create a market for opiate narcotics by stimulating the practice of marijuana smoking. Marijuana was not the determining factor in the commission of major crimes, as was stated by Aslinger, nor was it a cause for juvenile delinquency. Finally, the publicity concerning the catastrophic effects of marijuana smoking in New York is unfounded. Aslinger condemned it, of course. But this is what you see through history, the prohibition. There's this game of tennis. So somebody will throw in all these lies, and then somebody will do a commission and throw it back, and as it goes on. So So in 1951, the Boggs Act is quite important because this is where the sort of gateway theory came from. So the danger is this: over 50% of those young addicts starting on marijuana smoking, they started there and graduated to heroin. They took the needle when the thrill of marijuana was gone. He justified the mandatory minimum sentences by saying, short sentences do not deter in districts where we get good sentences. The drug traffic does not flourish. So this very much goes to what one of the first slides was, where we're looking at what the Home Office is saying today. So the gateway drug came from the Boggs Act, but also the deterrent effect, which is very much a big part of policy. They try to deter people from taking cannabis, which obviously hasn't worked. So it was interesting that because people, because they have these minimum sentences now, trying to cross the border from Mexico with a load of cannabis, there's so much of it, it was really difficult to do. Heroin was much easier, of course, because you only need smaller amounts. So this Boggs Act actually led to a huge heroin epidemic in the US. And this also gave them the authority to change the law for Aslanger's men to tap telephones, carry firearms, and arrest without warrants. So they were already taking away people's civil liberties. Timothy Leary, I'm sure you've all heard of him, Mr. Psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin. He was described by Richard Nixon as the most dangerous man in America. But he was actually arrested on the Mexican border in 1965 for possession and illegal transportation of marijuana. Now, it was actually half a joint and a couple of grams of weed. It was nothing. So he was actually arrested and he was given a sentence of 30 years and a $40,000 fine. He obviously appealed against that, and in 1969 he took it to the Supreme Court. Now, the court looked at this was the first time the Supreme Court actually had a proper look at the Marijuana Tax Act. And they declared that the Marijuana Tax Act was unconstitutional under the Fifth Amendment. So I said before that by incriminating themselves, by giving their details that gets passed to the authorities, they're actually criminalizing themselves, and that's a breach of the Fifth Amendment. So they found that unconstitutional. So what they stated at the end was, Congress has no more constitutional power to tell a jury it can convict upon any such forced and baseless inference than it has the power to tell juries they can convict a defendant of a crime without any evidence at all from which an inference of guilt could be drawn. So that was the end of the Marijuana Tax Act. So good on Timothy Leary. And he actually challenged the law. And this is what we all need to do now. So in 1971, this was the beginning of the war on drugs, and coincidentally the same year that the Misuse of Drugs Act was enacted here in the UK. And this was the beginning of the 50-year war on drugs. The Controlled Substance Act gave authorities the power to disrupt their meetings, and this was referred to hippies being against the war and blacks, imprison their leaders and wage a propaganda war against them in the American media. So they did this big report, and Nixon was really pleased that this report was happening because it would just carry on condemning cannabis. But Schaefer, although he was quite hard-lined, he actually did his job properly, and he found that there was no actual evidence of harms and that it should never have been made illegal. So what they actually came up with was the Commission feels that the criminalization of possession of marijuana for personal use be self-defeating as a means of achieving this objective. We have attempted to balance individual freedom on one hand and the obligation of the state to consider the wider social good on the other. We believe our recommended scheme will permit society to exercise its control and influence in ways most useful and efficient, meanwhile reserving to the individual American his sense of privacy, his sense of individuality, and within the context of an interacting and independent society, his options to select his own lifestyle, values, goals, and opportunities. So basically protecting our human rights. So that kind of shows you what happened in the UK, what happened in America, and then the biggest thing that happened was international. So at the UN, they had the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs in 1961, 60 years ago. In 1954, the World Health Organization, their position on medical use was that there was no justification whatsoever for medical use of cannabis. Complete lies. They knew the truth. When assessing the physical, mental, and social harms, which is what the ACMD do today, the WHO presented a report, and you can find this on our website, actually. This report was called The Physical and Mental Effects of Cannabis, and it was proper reefer madness propaganda. You read it, and it's kind of funny but sad at the same time. But this was from the World Health Organization, who you're supposed to trust. So some of the things that they said... So, under the influence of cannabis, the danger of committing unprecedented murder is very great. It can happen in cold blood, without any reason or motive, unexpectedly, without any preceding quarrel. Often the murderer doesn't even know the victim and simply kills for pleasure. How many people do you know who have done that after a joint? Come on.
No takers?
So 60 years ago, cannabis was finally placed within Schedule 4 and Schedule 1. So it was put there internationally with heroin, cocaine, and all the hardest drugs. And it remains there today, although in last year it did get removed from Schedule 4, but it's still a Schedule 1. Do you know what a Schedule 1 drug is? It means it has no medicinal value. It's high propensity for harm and addiction. It's been proven again and again that it doesn't fit that standard, It can't be a Schedule 1 drug. It's just impossible.
And it all ties to the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, which is what kind of controls our actions with this plant in this country. And that is all based upon the 1961 United Nations Narcotic Drugs Convention. And they drew it from there. And again, as Guy's been saying, they do it on the basis of it's supposed to be harmful, and in this country we're supposed to have the ACMD, which is I'm going to read it out. Cannabis does affect your memory, by the way. Not your brain, but your memory, it does. It's the Advisory Council of Misuse of Drugs, and they are supposed to independently advise our government without bias. And I would say that they've failed massively, and again, if you do get this book off Amazon, shameless plug, all money goes towards the case, by the way. No one gets any money. In there, we actually analysed the 2008, 2012, I think, ACMD reports, and we ripped them to pieces, basically, because the governments have picked up on little tiny sentences, and that's the basis of justifying their entire policy. But if you look at it and read what they say, it actually doesn't justify their policy. So as a result of all of that Guy has just mentioned, it was placed under the Misuse of Drugs Act, and 50 years later, it carries a Class B penalty and is allegedly a Schedule 1 drug. But it falls into several schedules nowadays, doesn't it? Yeah. So in our journey, like I say, I didn't mention at the beginning, I used to be a teacher, by the way. I'm not a legal expert or anything like that, although some people would say I was. I used to teach 4 subjects, so I know how to study academically and research things. And whilst I was studying and finding things out, came across a few interesting things. A gentleman called Trev Coleman, who I've got to give full credit to, he asked his local PCC, I'm speaking really quick because of time, about the foundation evidence. Can you provide the evidence for the Schedule 1 status of cannabis? And the late PCC Hogg now said, no, that can't be provided. So the question is, if you haven't got the evidence for this, then how can you prosecute? So myself, WTU, our organisation, Seed Our Future, and also Uncle Tony, who may know... Oh, there he is. Thank you at the back. Philip Anthony Bevington, sending Freedom of Information requests. We're talking quite a significant volume of Freedom of Information requests as well. And they're up on the websites, WTU and Seed Our Future. And we asked for the foundation evidence that it meets the claim for Schedule 1 status. We asked for the evidence that all of the different preparations of cannabis meet the Schedule 1 status. We asked for the evidence of the proof of misuse, because it is the Misuse of Drugs Act. I wrote to the government in 2014, told them I'm growing my own cannabis for medical purposes. I do not misuse it, therefore you cannot come and arrest me. I'm still at home cultivating my own cannabis, and they haven't come to arrest me. There might be some validity in that, but they have got no evidence for what is misuse. And then the other one is this proof of control. It's a controlled drug. Okay, well, if there's a control, why can no longer in school, why could my kid, when he was in school, get cannabis easier than I could get it, who needed it for pain? Because obviously, if they have control of this controlled drug, they've epically failed, because it's on the street, it's in the schools, it's in the prisons, and it's in Westminster. There's more drugs in Westminster than on the streets, perhaps, but they get away with it because they're the political class, and the eyes of the law only look in one direction, and that's our direction. So during my journey of research, of digging, well, I was actually going to have my bones chopped in half and plated back together, and I thought, God, I know tobacco is a poison, but what does cannabis do to my body? So I started researching. I came across, next slide please, Guy. I came across, I've got to say one thing from the last slide. When I was reading Black's Law Dictionary, I came across this thing. You've all heard of guilty until proven innocent, I presume? Yeah? So that's a maxim of law. It's like a rule of law, but not a law. And I found a maxim of law that says an act invalid from the start cannot be validated by subsequent acts, which basically translates to, if the Misuse of Drugs Act, specifically relating to cannabis and its prohibition, but forget the other ones for the moment, if they haven't got the evidence, if it's invalid from the start, every single act thereafter cannot be valid. Therefore, every act is unlawful. So in my digging, I came across, next slide, sorry, Guy, 1998. Philip Robson was commissioned by the Home Office. Now, I did mention previously, all that research is where they were trying to prove how harmful cannabis is to humanity. All they did was prove how good it was. So GW Pharmaceuticals, well, that didn't even arrive. In 1996, the Home Office asked Philip Robson to investigate the therapeutic aspects of cannabinoids. He spent 2 years investigating. In 1998, he returned his paper back to the British government. It was published in 2001 publicly. And he basically found, it's a heck of a lot of information, in a summary of 3 points. One, cannabis is remarkably therapeutic, of millennia of safe usage in humans, including Queen Victoria for her period pains. Number 2 is time is needed to develop marketable cannabis-based medical preparations, CBMPs, that later became known in this decade. And also, number 3, they said to the government should cease the criminalisation of peaceful people who assuage their symptoms, you good folks, with natural herbal cannabis. And the government of the day decided to stick that report on the Library of Science shelf of drug addiction and science. And they decided not to share it with the British public and not to disseminate it. They also decided to then set that set that researcher up as medical director of GW Pharmaceuticals, which has just been sold for $5.3 billion, that was set up with 13% of your money, by the way, because you are all taxpayers, but you didn't get any of that return, did you? And in that time, they've spent 21 years and they've made over 138 patents for cannabis. In that time, they've destroyed the lives like my good brother that's now dead. He went to prison for a cannabis offence, came out heroin addict, long story short, it's dead. On the basis of it was a harmful drug, we've got to protect you with criminalisation. But in that time, they've made 138 patents and $5 billion, pounds. So, again, justified and proportionate. So, if we go... sorry, I do go on. What's the time? If we look at the next slide quickly, sorry, Guy, because I'm aware of time massively. The ACMD between 2002 2008, like the psychosis and schizophrenia, they've verified, yeah, there might be a correlation, but they can't confirm what they call causation. They don't know if people are treating their illness with this stuff or if it's causing it. They can't say. And it seems... it's the treating it. And again, we touched on the addiction, the brain damage, and everything else that was touched on. Their own research now has disproved them through their own research. And I'd encourage you to get that, to go through the full analysis, because it is in depth. Do you want to jump on making the hash of it, and I'll come on to equity and proportionality in a second?
Yeah. During the time that these ACMD reports were being made, in 2006, the Science and Select Committee commissioned a report into the ACMD and the scheduling. And they found it was just totally inadequate. It was very political, it was based on a deterrent effect, but there wasn't any science of the harms. Colin Blakemore, Chief Executive of the Medical Research Council at the time, he described the Misuse of Drugs Act classification, saying, "It is antiquated and reflects the prejudice and misconceptions of an era in which drugs were placed in arbitrary categories with notable, often illogical consequences." So he was basically saying, yeah, it's the same old story from the past. It's vital that the government's approach to drug education is evidence-based. A more scientifically based scale of harm would have greater credibility than the current system, where the placing of drugs in particular categories is ultimately a political decision. So it wasn't based on truth. And not just cannabis, but other drugs. It was actually in the report when they looked at psilocybin, because they had just turned magic mushrooms into a Class A drug. And when they asked, where's the evidence, the chairman of the ACMD said, well, it's just there because it's there. You know, there's not really any evidence. It's not really been looked at since the 1950s, 1960s, where there was sort of potential medical use. And they said, well, what about the toxicity? You know, is it really dangerous? Can you die from it? They said, well, basically, you would have to eat your whole body weight of magic mushrooms to die from it. Just like cannabis, it's impossible to die from toxicity. So why are these in Class A and Class B?
Sorry. 15 kilos in 15 minutes for cannabis, isn't it?
That would be one huge spliff.
Yeah. It's what you were saying about it being political, interestingly, because I think it was Tisme next, is it?
It is now, yeah.
Nick his slide. You mentioned the political aspect of it. When I started We the Undersigned Have a Human Sovereign Right to Cannabis, it was to try and find a solicitor to make a human rights case. Because I'd read the Human Rights Act that stated various things, but every solicitor I called and asked if they would represent us said it's too political, take too long, and will cost too much. And in fact, it's the costing too much that's stopping us at the minute. But during my journey, like we talked about equity, didn't we? The substances like the recreational drugs, alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, and sugar, for example, that are far more harmful to human health, physiology, and arguably society than cannabis. But the law isn't equitable in the way it treats, I'm not going to say those substances, but the consumers of them substances. Now, I've learned here, like we've got the proportionality we're talking about. Is the law proportional in its application? So someone who's quietly using cannabis and not harming anybody, who then gets prosecuted and gets put in prison, loses their home, their job, their family, their children, is it proportional in the application of that legislation? Have they reduced harm, which is the fundamental purpose of the Misuse of Drugs Act? So as I was reading Human Rights Act, both... sorry, I can't really talk right now. As I was researching human rights, United Nations, European and UK, so we've got like the 3 levels of legislation. And in the UK, they've enshrined those legislation policy into UK law. So we do have the freedom of consciousness in the UK law. That is the right to explore your consciousness as you choose, as long as you're not harming another. And also the free development of personality, the autonomy of health, the right to private beliefs and practices, the expression of identity, the freedom of association, which is what we're doing today, like we're all congregating to practice our beliefs and celebrate our beliefs in cannabis. They're all human rights that no one has got any right ever to take from you. Unless, I'm going to read this out because I don't want to get it wrong, and I have mentioned how cannabis affects your memory. So this is from Liberty, in fact. The only time that the government can infringe on your fundamental human rights is to protect national security, to protect public safety, to protect the economy, to protect health or morals, to prevent disorder or crime, and protect the rights and freedom of others. This is only allowed where the authority can show that the action is lawful and necessary and proportionate to achieve those aims. So my argument is, when they get me before a jury, is I want to see your evidence that you can prove all of those things, and that's why I would encourage everyone, don't plead guilty and challenge it. So this is the ultimate question, and this reflects to modern legislation that's about to come down on all your necks that you probably haven't read. Is it justified, and is it proportionate? And they're about to slam a whole new legislation that's neither justified nor proportionate, and this Misuse of Drugs Act is going to pale into insignificance. But that's a different story, and I'm going to pass it to Guy now.
So in March this year, myself and Phil published a document which is available on our websites, and it really is what this presentation is based on. The Golden Nugget, which was actually a WTU member, I'm not sure
it was,
of his
I
name.
can't recall their name, forgive me at the moment.
They came across this real golden nugget, and they found that in 2009, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime looked at the human rights of criminalisation for personal use, possession, and so on. And in 2010, this was affirmed by the UN General Assembly, and they found that the criminalisation of the personal use, possession, or cultivation of an illicit substance is a breach of the human right to health, which is Article 12 of International Human Rights, especially if it's an essential medicine. Now, because we all have an endocannabinoid system, you can't argue that cannabis is not an essential medicine. So the UN have claimed that it's a breach of our human right to health, a very important human right, to criminalise you for personal use possession. So human rights must prevail. So the UN also said, when the goals and approaches of the international drug control regime and international human rights regime conflict with statute laws, it is clear that human rights obligations should prevail. So we all have a human right to health, we all have a right to essential medicine. So why are these human rights being ignored by the government? You know, they have a duty of care to all of us. So, unfortunately, we're seeing the same history repeat itself. We're seeing corporate monopolization of the cannabis industry, potentially. We've seen this with the CBD industry over the last couple of years, the novel food specifically, the Kit Malthouse's letter in January, where they were instead of the 1 milligram of THC rule, they're now looking at 12 cannabinoids being classed as illicit substances, and they're looking at as low as 0.0001% of any of these 12 cannabinoids. So that's the end of full spectrum. All you're going to be able to get is isolate or synthetic products. And this is so disturbing because, you know, we've got such a great CBD industry in the UK. It's grassroots, it's cottage industry, it's what it should be, you know, all trying to produce good quality products, make sure everybody has access to full spectrum cannabinoids. But that's been taken out of our hands. I'm not going to say by who, but, you know, that really needs to change and we need to bring it back. We need to start challenging this. We need to increase the THC level of hemp. We need to just tell Novel Foods to go jump. I was at a meeting with the head of Novel Foods in 2017 when I worked for the CTA. And Ruth Willis, who was the head of Novel Foods, she told me that the Home Office had been putting loads of pressure on them to class all cannabinoids as novel. At the time, it was full botanical extracts of full spectrum was fine. That wasn't novel. And there was plenty of history to prove that. It was isolate that was novel. But they turned it completely on their heads. And this is coming from the Home Office, the pressure from the Home Office to change it, to destroy our industry. So we need to start fighting back for that industry. Phil?
Well, it's interesting, like this medical cannabis, you may have heard my question in the previous talk, which was really well delivered, but they mentioned medical cannabis and recreational cannabis, and I'm always questioning, what is this medical cannabis everyone's talking about all the time? The cannabis for medical use is what it should be technically referred to specifically, and as it says here, it's available for those who can afford it. I presented myself to the pain clinic and they said, yeah, I want to give you cannabis. I know it helps you, but the NHS guidelines won't allow me, sorry, so you can't have it. And I've nearly been killed 4 times by the poisonous pharmaceutical drugs, so I won't go there anymore. But cannabis for medical purposes is now available in the UK. It has been by law since 2018. If you've got enough money to pay the right person, you can have it and you are protected from prosecution. Now, it's not even that complicated to get. You don't have to be sick and dying. You just have to express a genuine need for it. But the maths of that, like there's a project called Project 21, which is doing a research search thing. If you give them your data, they'll give you a discount, which is a marvellous exchange, £5 a gram. I use about 7 grams a day for me because I grow my own. So I did the maths on this, and my medical cannabis, as they call it, would be £12,700 a year. I can't afford that. I live on universal credit and PIP. So I actually calculated, I'm a bit of a grow geek, it turns out, and I calculated how much VAT I've contributed to the Treasury and how much it cost me to cultivate my cannabis for my medical purposes. And it cost me less than £2,000 a year. So it's an economic no-brainer in my mind that people should be able to grow for themselves. And the fact that I cultivate Gorilla Glue and they call that recreational, but you go into London and buy it from a clinic and it's called medical, just again, well, it's the final processes, the last people answer my question. But medical cannabis or cannabis for medical purposes is here, but it's just completely unfair. But we've got in the background big tobacco and alcohol, the other big drug players in the country, in the world even, and they are now investing into cannabis moves because they want to get in on this. And
we've seen this in Canada, haven't we?
Yeah. And it will bring the change. Time, Guy. You go to the next one, then we get to Fat Card.
Yeah, and then there's hemp or industrial cannabis. Is that going to be corporate takeover? Is it going to be pleasant lands or is it going to be corporate? We can't allow it to be taken over by corporate. We can't see history repeat itself. We need to make sure we take control of this industry. And there's loads of new technologies, graphene technology, biofuels, even aviation fuel. That's 90% less emissions. The technology's there. All we need is the infrastructure. If we could get the government to scrap the licensing, maybe pass it to DEFRA, increase the THC level to, say, 1%, which will increase seed yield by 10 times. You'll get better fibre, and you'll increase the cannabinoid profile massively. Industrial hemp normally only has about 3% CBD. So, you know, we have the technology. We have the farmers are dying to get into this industry, but the bureaucracy, the red tape is just destroying it. So, meanwhile, the majority of users, growers, social clubs, compassion clubs, who do great work, helping save many lives, continue to be politically persecuted. And that's what it is, political persecution. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a political law. It's not based on evidence. So, and also small to medium-sized enterprises like the CBD industry, they're being kicked out, and so that, you know, CBD industry, to get full spectrum, soon it's going to be over-the-counter medicine, which means it's going back into the hands of the pharmaceutical industry. They're taking it out of our hands. So we need to do something about that. So why don't we challenge the law, you know? We're all scared. Neil Woods, when he was here before talking, he was saying about the propaganda machine of the police, and they show all these pictures of people getting their doors kicked in and everything. It's a fear campaign. Fear works. Fear controls minds. We're scared. We're hiding. We shouldn't hide anymore. We've got the evidence that it's wrong. We all need to come together and actually challenge this. So if we actually challenge the charges, don't accept a caution, don't accept the charges, and actually fight it. Take it to the court. Take this evidence to the court. Explain the human rights in a Crown Court, not a magistrate's. And we can actually win. The judicial system at the moment is at breaking point. You know, if everybody challenged the charges at the same time, it would collapse the judicial system. We can take the police to court. The police aren't following their due diligence, which we're going to come to soon, and they're actually breaking the law. It's false arrest and false imprisonment. Let's start suing the police. They're the low-hanging fruit. So I'm going to take that to Phil then.
Well, yeah, it brings us back. This is a culmination of the collaboration of myself, Guy, and another gentleman, Colin Craig, who's running around like a headless chicken. Is he? Oh, he's here. There he is. Sorry, Colin. You're brilliant. Colin has defended himself. How many times, Colin? 14? Lots of times. I'll tell you, a sheet as long as your arm for how many times he's been harassed by the law for cannabis. It turns out he has genuine medical purpose, Crohn's, I believe it is, and you should go and speak with Colin if you want to hear quite a profound story, and also be empowered by someone that stopped paying the solicitor to process him and just take his money, find him guilty and fine him, to actually stand still and say, hold on a minute, Your Honour, no, I can't plead guilty to this. And what Colin came to me and suggested, and to Guy, and we've built Fact Card UK. Come and get one off us at the end, by all means. Now, this is a website.
.co.uk.
Factcard.co.uk. And now this is a website where we have basically compiled, open source for everybody, the information bundles that we have compiled, collate 6 or 7 bundles there, that can be used as a defence. So people can then say, I can't plead guilty to this, Your Honour, because I've read this document, this document, this document. And this card isn't about getting your money off you, and it isn't about getting your details off you. We don't want either, although you can give us a quid for it if you'd like to cover the cost. This is about empowering people, lifting you up so you're not the low-hanging fruit anymore to get easy pickings. This is for you to take to the police. And in fact, when they stop you and say, I want to arrest you, say, I just want to take this card out of my pocket, officer, and then I'm going to exercise my right to silence. And you take the card out of your pocket and you say, I just want to give you that. Read that, please, officer. And then you're stum. You don't say nothing more. You stand silent. And that gives them an opportunity to choose not to arrest you. It gives them a warning that if you arrest me, I may well hold you legally liable for your actions as an officer, because they are legally liable for their actions. And then also, it's really saying, please arrest me. I want you to arrest me. Let's go down to the interview room, because we've got some information we want to get on tape. Now, we wanted to take them to court. Too political, take too long, cost too much money. WTU didn't raise enough money, so we can't take them to court. What we can do is empower people, give them the knowledge, so then they can defend themselves as litigant in persons and challenge the law, and hopefully set a precedent going upwards instead of down. So it'll just end the war so that people aren't being busted and prosecuted. It's in 4 courts, I think, at the minute. Various aspects of the bundles have been submitted and are being used as defences. If you would like to ask more questions, come and speak to me about that afterwards. But it is, like you've said, challenge the law. Don't take the pink slip. Don't take the caution. Don't take the easy way out. Make it hard for the bastards. Sorry. Put the burden of proof on the Crown Prosecution Service. You want to prosecute me for a Schedule 1 drug? show me the evidence, then I might plead guilty to it. And everyone, I tell you all, do the same. Like, make it hard for them. Too easy at the minute. And if you plead guilty, if you take the caution, you are supporting the system and propping it up and perpetuating the misery. So I would say, challenge the law. It's an ass. Thank you, Guy.
So, just to add a little bit to that, the police have something called an attestation, which is their oath that they swear when they go into the office of constable. And they have to abide by their due diligence, so they should know the law. We've come across loads of police recently who've been arresting people for having medical cannabis because they didn't know the law changed in 2018.
He means cannabis for medical purposes by that statement.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, but, ignorance, we're always told ignorance of the law is no excuse.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly no excuse for an officer of the law. So, really important. So we can actually take the police to court for these sort of things. So, truth is our sword, unity our shield is the emblem for Seed Our Future campaign. So we've got the truth, we've developed all the research, we've got the evidence that there's no evidence, that it's not a crime. But our shield is very small. We've only got, between us, we've only got 6,000-7,000 people?
Well, Facebook deleted my group of 6,200 people, so I've just been reduced to less than 1,000 people in WTU now.
So the reason we're here today is we want to unite the industry, the users, everyone who loves the plant needs to come together right now and work together. If we change public opinion, we can change the law. That's the way to do it. We need to get rid of the fear, the stigma. Education is key for that. A political war can be won by political opinion. So finally, path to a green future. So what's the future? What would we like to see? Personally, I don't want to see legalization or decriminalization because that still hands it to the corporations. What we want is descheduling. It should never have been placed in Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 in the first place. So if it was descheduled and completely removed from it, what would that create? Well, it would give us the right to cultivate our own medicine. We have brewers' rights. If you've got an orchard and some apple trees, you can make your own cider. It's one of the most dangerous toxic drugs on the planet. We can do that, but we can't grow a non-toxic plant. We want a regulated free market. So, anything that goes into the market that's sold has to be regulated. But we need to protect the grassroots and the cottage industry. We need investment in the industrial technologies, like I mentioned before. It's there, we just need the money. And also, really, we should have pardons and reparations for everybody who's been harmed by this war.
Yeah.
People who have lost their families, lost their jobs, been imprisoned for something that's not a crime. They should get recompense for that. So, that's pretty much the end of the thing. So, please join our fight for freedom, for our health, our environment and our economy. And you can see here, these are the websites for our two organisations. So please follow us on social media, look at the reports that we've written, educate yourself, and then use that education. Let's all come together and win this war.
Yeah, I'd have to say buy the book, because that could be your defence. Until people, lots of people are getting it, but I think it's £3.36 is made from every book. No one gets that. It's all into the legal fund. So one day, we might be able to take them to the Supreme Court, one way or another.
Also, the fat card, we are selling them for £1, but it is available for free to print out on the website for those who can't afford £1. And it is made out of 100% cannabis. So if the police stop you and say, have you got any cannabis on you? Yes,
yes, I have.
Educate yourself. So thank you very much. Question?
Well, I was just going to say the last thing, but just tell everyone, don't be silent, speak, tell your truth.
Guys, we're going to have to ask some questions aside because we're running a little bit late. But
we're over there.
Phil Monk and Guy Coxhall, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.